I am DM Zone. This is Gamers Oasis. Let's get into it. Okay, guys, we're going to talk real quickly about humans in original Dungeons and Dragons. I'm going to start off real quick with sort of like an answer to the thing, and I'm going to come right back to the video. One could argue that magic fixes a lot of the shortcomings of humans. Humans don't really benefit from a lack of limits until much later on in the game. Most games will end by then, so it doesn't really matter. They don't really benefit from not living very long, as most people don't deal with time properly in the game. Therefore, the shorter lifespan of a human doesn't really matter. If the referee doesn't focus a lot on the social side of things, there's very little reason to play a fighter that is not a dwarf, a magic user that is not an elf, and there is basically no reason to play a halfling. I hope that's not your experience, and if it is, please send your referee a link to some of my videos. Maybe I can help. In this video, I'm going to go a bit more in depth on what Mr. Gygax's logic was for this book. Since this is not necessarily for everyone, I'm going to put a timestamp so you can skip that portion, and then I'm going to put that up here, and then you can go ahead and watch just the part that refers to original Dungeons & Dragons humans. So in this book, humans were the major focus of the game. Dungeons & Dragons was based around the fact that most characters you run into, most NPCs you run into, most everyone you run into is a human. It's what's considered a human-centric game. But it's funny because the book only uses the word human 6 times. And 2 of those are a reference to non-human, referring to what some might also call demi-human class or races. And 4 times specifically for human, but even those are not specifically for a playable race. One is comparing a 6th level dwarf to a 10th level human. Now, one would assume they mean a human fighter, but they don't specifically say that. It's not clearly stated, shall we say. There are 2 references towards the common tongue being mostly known by humans, and that try and tempt a human to work for you requires at least 100 gold. The closest thing that I would say you get to human, though, is on page 5, at least in my version. And I'm not going to say that every time I list a page, so just know when I say that I'm referring to my version. There are more than one version of the game. Sometimes the page numbers vary just a little bit, but it'd be right in that area. Underneath a section called Preparation for the Campaign. Why this is so important is to show what inspired the rules and how they were wrote. Normally rules that are clearly wrote are considered to be in technical writing. There's not a lot of extra slang or unnecessary words. It's very specific and locked in, shall we say. As I was digging deeper into like the word choices that he has used over the years and all, it wasn't like, in my research at least, it wasn't like I found that technical writing was wrote afterwards. I mean, technically, he wasn't fully on a computer. The books were wrote on a typewriter and then were edited. But that makes you want to think, why did he not do this even more? This was a harder way to write than being technical. Technical writing was not invented after Dungeons and Dragons. From my research, it shows that basically the era of Cro-Magnon men or women, people, were using some form of that when they were identifying livestock and wild games and dangerous animals and this type of stuff. They kind of have a classification system. The golden era of technical writing, though, was considered to start when the computers were first being really brought in a major way. And this is the 1940s. In like 1949, the first like medical technical manual was ever released or something. So that gives you an idea of like when it really was probably in its height. Employers were seeking out employees to do this type of writing was right at like 1950. I feel like other games had come out that were being technically wrote. I mean, you have Avalon Hill making games. I feel like that didn't reach the people that Gygax was wanting to reach, and that is why he didn't want to be that close to a technical writing style. So there are several uses of the word man as a playable race. In this section, I'm basically going to prove that man and human were essentially interchangeable. On page 12, underneath the section of language, there were stats associated to man. Another can be found where they're talking about the morale of a man. This is found on page 15. Underneath the section weight that can be carried, you see an interesting relationship talking about men or man carrying things. There was an additional few interesting playable considerations. One of them in particular was in many parts of the book, was actually started in chainmail, and that was fighting capability on page 17. There was also certain spells. I'm going to list a couple of them, but there were more. Charm Person or Polymorph Other are two pretty good examples on pages 23 and 26 of book 1. However, the best example that probably would say as clearly as it had been said without directly saying it was the reincarnation spell. This talks about the relationship of levels, alignment, class with someone that is brought back by a spell. Clearly basically saying that humans were what man was. So why the confusion? Why did he not just say the thing and move on? My experience, my understanding is it was basically a tool to simplify language in a generalization way. You see, the word man was considered gender neutral for a very long time. It didn't necessarily mean male. So if it didn't mean male, it certainly didn't mean anti-female. And not until about 1,000 years ago did we even start to assign gender to the word man. And this is accepted by historians and scholars who study this far more than probably anyone that's going to watch my video. Continuing down that aspect just a little bit, my research shows that it wasn't always spelled M-A-N. It was actually spelled W-E-R when it was in Old English, and V-I-R when it was in Latin. The root of this is like werewolf, wolf or man-wolf. You get the idea. So with that said, let's dive into humans more in the Dungeons & Dragons sense of things. Human is the only race that can be all the classes. The 3 original classes was fighter, cleric, and magic user. To my knowledge, they're the only race that can be all the classes throughout all the different versions or the different expansion pieces of the game, the supplements and all that. All of the non-human classes, or demi-human classes as they are sometimes called, especially in later editions, can only be certain classes. They're also the only class that doesn't suffer from level restrictions or limits, as original Dungeons & Dragons technically didn't have a level cap. They could go on forever. Now, what you got is not really detailed in original Dungeons & Dragons, so that's sort of a soft cap, I guess. Also, the reality is most people weren't able to play the character long enough to be able to do that, and if everyone else was restricted and you only could use humans, and humans weren't necessarily the most popular class play or race played, you might have a character that's not dead, but you have no one to play with. So, there is that. In original Dungeons & Dragons, there was not bonuses like there are now in modern versions. No +2 con, no +2 intelligence or dexterity or whatever. The closest one gets towards that is racial abilities like improved sight in darkness or longer lifespans, for example. If one were to just look into that, it would appear that they have nothing. Gygax never speaks directly to the benefit of humans outside of them being human. This is probably because of something I've said in several other videos prior to this one in the series. It was just a well-known thing amongst his community, and he didn't feel like he needed to state it in the rule book for people to be able to understand it. It would be expressed at the table, and since space and editing were limited, it was not included in the rule books. In my opinion, based on the interviews I've heard and read and the blog posts from people that were there during the time, the human population was the dominant majority in the referees' worlds, basically. And I would say there are about 3 or 4 really strong benefits as a group to being a human. First is that as the majority, most people speak their language, understand their cultures, customs, and they have a neutral to positive implicit bias. Most referees, as they're called back then, would have had minority groups within these humans that further divide them up, but that goes into the implicit bias towards the other non-humans. So if you have a group of humans that are this and a group of humans that are that, and then you have dwarves who are just that, it means that the humans actually have more depth of character than maybe a dwarf does. Probably far less referees had several types of dwarves, several types of elves that were distinguishable, that had different cultures and customs, locations. You know, you probably just had lip service paid. Wood elf, high elf, that type of thing. Mountain dwarf. I mean, maybe they had hill dwarves, valley dwarves, gully dwarves, but probably not. That's at least my experience. Your mileage may vary. As they are the majority also, I would say that larger populations tend to be more tolerant towards this, as it's considered to be more of a mixing pot, and smaller tribes, like groups, clan type stuff, tend to be less tolerant towards this, as their communities, their circles, their interactions with people is less. Getting any more into what that is smacks of the real world drama that we face, and that's something I like to keep outside of my game. I play to escape reality, and most of the time that's about as close as I want to get towards that type of stuff. Second, after that massive point I just made, humans are also so diverse and are doing so many things that to say they are good at something would be overstating who that human is, and starting to smack a little bit what they call explicit bias. I'll go ahead and show you a slide of both explicit and implicit bias so you have an understanding maybe of what that is. But basically, implicit bias is something that normally can be controlled and is fairly natural. It's based on your life experiences. Explicit bias is known, maybe understood, but other emotions are driving it, whether it's fear, anger, or some other phobia like that, generally. This is, again, a general statement, too large for this video and the scope of what we're doing. We're playing a game here, trying to have some level of realism, but not necessarily making it a political statement as we're playing the game, if that makes sense. Third example I guess I could give. This is more represented if the referee takes this into consideration, but they shouldn't receive negs. They, in this case, is the humans. Humans should not receive negatives from the other races as much, because humans are basically everywhere. They kind of blur together. They all look the same. Humans are treated more as a individual because that's what you know. There may be some bias towards you're not us, you're them, like with dwarves and elves and probably halflings and whatnot. But anything more specific other than a little bit of xenophobia, fear of others, would be untoward, it would not be earned. Whereas, again, elves and dwarves having so few different groups, and the fact that classes are literally called dwarf instead of a dwarf that can be a fighter, or an elf that can be a magic user. Elf was basically a class. Now, that breaks down a little bit outside of the 3 core books with elves, but I'll get to that more specifically in the elf section when I do the elf video. The humans were not so closely tied to an alignment. That's where we come into our 4th one. They can, in general, get along with societies outside of their own. A less common benefit that humans tend to be able to work with is the fact that they can, with a change of clothes, dress the same as a different culture. With a little bit of energy spent, they can act like a different culture. They can fit in with different groups. If you're a dwarf, or an elf, or a halfling that's on the run because you were accused or you did something, you would have less ability to fit in with these other groups. And since everywhere you go is a human place, you're going to have a harder time. Now, the dwarves might take you in because you're a dwarf more than a human would take in a human because they're human. But a human wouldn't need that because they just would fit in. And no one would know of their existence. There is no chance of being betrayed unless it's, something a little bigger. Also, if you're trying to sneak into like the cult of the Flaming Eye, which is by majority a chaotic human cult, you would have a much better, easier chance, or a chance at all, if you were not an elf, a dwarf, or a halfling. And if you were, or you did happen to be those, you'd be so rare they would know who you are versus you know who they are. Again, depending on your referee, your mileage may differ. But in my world, the perks for being human are there. Mostly because they need them. They don't really get a lot else. Let's talk into some of the things they do get, some of the benefits that were actually there that humans don't get to participate in. They don't get benefits towards secret passage, doors, traps, new construction, etc., those type of things. They don't get the better vision like infravision, dark vision, or ultravision. They do not get to sense slopes, know their depth, which direction they're heading, where true north is, without the benefit of some sort of magical aid. Now, luckily, humans have access to magic, so eventually that kind of goes away. But again, at the critical levels, when you're first starting, these are things they don't get. The only one that kind of gets that are the halves, the half elves and the half orcs and this type of stuff. I'm not going to go too much into that in this video, but I can get into the fact that like with half elves, they get some of the level restrictions or limits that elves get, but it's better. They have the ability to be clerics like elves can in later supplements of the game. So the closest an elf would ever get to a cleric is a half elf or as a ranger. Ranger is not even technically anywhere near a cleric. It just has access. It's more of a hybrid than anything in reality, though. So in conclusion, one could argue that magic fixes a lot of the shortcomings of humans. Humans don't really benefit from a lack of limits until much later on in the game. Most games will end by then, so it doesn't really matter. They don't really benefit from not living very long, as most people don't deal with time properly in the game. Therefore, the shorter lifespan of a human doesn't really matter. If the referee doesn't focus a lot on the social side of things, there's very little reason to play a fighter that is not a dwarf, a magic user that is not an elf, and there is basically no reason to play a halfling. I hope that's not your experience, and if it is, please send your referee a link to some of my videos. Maybe I can help. I'm going to continue going over all the different races, the classes, and this type of stuff, as I've already started through the supplements, as well as many other related magazines, both official and fandom, as I want to create more of an understanding about this, as this game was one of the foundational games that inspired so many different games that came after it, both pen and paper and video game. And I want to talk about all of those at different points in times over the next probably, hopefully, years. So if you want to watch more videos like this, please give me a like, give me a subscribe. Let me know down in the comment what you think I should be doing next, and we'll look into it. Anyways, guys, hope you guys enjoy this video. Keep rolling those dice, and I'll see you next one. Bye.